Let's get straight to the big news of the day. The Treasurer Jim Chalmers responding to that rate rise today and also responding to questions about his plans for his budget to be delivered. First budget, 3 weeks to the day. Our political editor Andrew Clennell is with me. And Andrew, understandably, a lot of focus around the Treasurer's language when it comes to those legislated and promised stage 3 tax cuts.
Yes, well, Jim Chalmers was never keen on these stage 3 tax cuts, taking them to the election in opposition. Anthony Albanese and Richard Marles were keener in terms of trying to win as many votes as they could. Now, Chalmers at one point got quite angry with me, Kieran, when I reported that was the case, but I had very good sources on it. And I recall Richard Marles coming on one Sunday agenda with me and saying, we do not want to get between Australians and a tax cut. Really the start of those moves which saw Shadow Cabinet in the end endorse them on the way to the election, making sure that if there were people on higher salaries who were undecided about how to vote, that they wouldn't see a risk in going to Labor. So you can see the stakes here. If the government dumps these, or they won't dump them, but if they amend them, and it could happen as early as this October budget from what we saw earlier. Now, just last week in Canberra, I was at a Jim Chalmers press conference where he said that in terms of tackling inflation now, altering the stage 3 tax cuts would have no effect because they don't come into place until 2024-25.
Even if we took some of the steps that people have been urging us to do on stage 3 tax cuts, that would not change the inflationary environment that we confront right now. We haven't changed our position on the tax cuts. We're taking into consideration the economic conditions now.
Boy, has his language changed today, but I'll take you to that in a minute. Now I want to show you earlier in the day with Tom Connell, the Assistant Treasurer Andrew Lee, basically dismissing any change to the stage 3 tax cut, saying we need that integrity with the electorate to keep hold of these, to keep this commitment.
We're sticking to the policies we took to the election. I think that's important for the integrity of the democracy.
Okay.
You saw before the election, big drop in the share of people who said that they could trust politicians to do the right thing. So it is important that after the election, we are the government that we said we would be.
So we saw speculation in the Australian Financial Review, Philip Curry this morning, there might be an alteration as early as the October budget to the stage 3 tax cuts. Could it be the case Jim Chalmers is on side with this, but he hasn't got the PM and Deputy there yet? I'm not sure. We'll soon find out. We'll know in 3 weeks, in fact. But I'm going to play you one by one these questions from journalists at this press conference, where Jim Chalmers does not rule out amending the stage 3 tax cuts. In fact, he talks about we have to look at Britain, have to look at this difficulty with fiscal and monetary policy. Here's Laura Tingle's question first.
Does that make you have cause for pause about the tax cuts for 2024?
Well, I think the broader point is sufficiently relevant to us, that when you get monetary policy and fiscal policy out of whack, as the Brits are at risk of doing, then there are consequences not just for the budget but for the economy as well.
Now David Crowe.
Incredibly negative response from the markets in the UK to the idea of future tax cuts funded by debt. Do you accept that there's a parallel with Australia because the stage 3 tax cuts are future tax cuts funded by debt?
A big part of our considerations is what's happening in the global economy, what's happening in the UK, the US, China, Europe, what that means for us at home. And so I think any responsible government sees what's happening in the UK and factors that into their own considerations.
Now to Greg Brown from The Australian.
Are you considering amending stage 3?
We haven't changed our position on stage 3. What I've said...
Discussions about changing policy internally?
Well, we haven't changed our policy, and I'm obviously not going to get into conversations that people have from time to time. We are obviously factoring in the context of that budget, including global deteriorating global conditions.
Real political speak that. We haven't changed our policy right now. Might in 3 weeks of budget time though. Now to Catherine Murphy.
But is the government considering amending, delaying or scrapping the stage 3 tax cuts in the October budget?
Well, it's a similar answer to what I gave, Greg. You know, we haven't changed our position. We haven't altered our position. Obviously, yeah, I understand your question. Yeah, I mean, obviously, any responsible government looks for ways to make the budget as sustainable and responsible as it can.
Now, Kieran, I know you really took note of the language there. You really felt it, that there seemed to be this movement there. But Jim Chalmers seeming to indicate he's been talking to ERC about this just in the last day or two. Will they come with him? As I say, I don't believe he ever wanted to go ahead with stage 3 tax cuts. He thought they could go to the election perhaps without backing it. He came on eventually in terms of the cabinet decision, but it took some doing. Let's have a look now at the 3 budget priorities he says this budget's about.
The 3 most important pieces of context for the budget that we are currently finalising is, first of all, high and rising inflation, rising interest rates and falling real wages. Secondly, deteriorating global outlook. The storm clouds are gathering again in the global economy. And thirdly, persistent structural pressures on the Australian budget in areas like health and NDIS and aged care and defence, and the rising costs of servicing Commonwealth debt.
And Andrew, looking back at the interview at the weekend on our program on Sunday, I think that this shift in language, if we go back to those comments where he says very explicitly that the UK is a cautionary tale and that it's not irrelevant to their deliberations with Katie Gallagher and so on, it seems that this was the genesis of this shift in the language. To me, when I heard that, it did prick my ears to think, OK, so is he going to use this for what? And it now looks like 48 hours later, we're starting to get an indication as to what that answer is.
Well, I'm just not convinced that the UK and Australia is like for like. I mean, the UK is in a massive inflationary crisis and a big energy crisis. I think Australia is in a better position, and it could be argued that in 24-25 things will have improved. And I know the Treasurer got a couple of questions on that. So for that reason, I always thought perhaps if they were going to alter stage 3 tax cuts, Kieran, they'd wait for the May budget and assess where things were at. But perhaps they're also thinking politically, just like they did with the petrol excise cut, if you're going to do something that hurts people or annoys them, do it earlier in the term. The cautionary tale, if I can borrow the Treasurer's language for the Treasurer, is other governments who've come in, such as the Abbott government, with first budgets that the public don't like, have never been forgiven for it. So this is a real political high wire for Jim Chalmers, and I'll be very interested to see where he lands on October 25.